The Second Red Scare. The Second Red Scare basically was an assault on American civil liberties, and it's going to last from the mid 1940s through the mid 1950s. We're going to see a couple things really fan the flames of the Second Red Scare. It's going to be things like the Cold War itself, fanned fears of communist subversion on American soil. And then there was the legitimate concern about espionage and just suspicion of those who were communist sympathizers. But really, we're going to see the Red Scare is going to be used as a weapon, specifically by the conservative wing of the Republican Party, and they're going to use it specifically against those who had actually built Roosevelt's New Deal. The Communist Party itself in America is in rapid decline after World War II. It actually gained more of a following during World War II with the alliance of the United States and the Soviet Union. But basically, members of the Communist Party are going to face a series of failures afterwards. It'd be things like communist leaders were defeated by others when trying to go for leadership positions in unions, and a lot of times they're actually outright frozen out of these kinds of positions. But then we're going to see Republicans use red baiting as a campaign issue. Basically, they would try to frighten voters about, oh, it's the commie Democrats. They would link communism with FDR, with the CIO, with labor unions. Now, don't get me wrong, Democrats had their own version of this kind of propaganda. They would try to convince voters basically, oh, Hitler prefers Republicans. Still, Truman's going to respond to this kind of red baiting with the executive order 9835. Sorry, it's just 9835. So this is how we see the Second Red Scare in the executive branch. Basically, this was made in March of 1947, and it initiated in a loyalty program for federal employees. But really what it was a blunt instrument authorizing the Attorney General to prepare a list of totalitarian, fascist, communist, or any kind of subversive organization. And if an individual working for the federal government or working for a defense contract was found to be a member of one of these organizations, that was grounds for dismissal. The thing is, this applied to about 8 million Americans who are working either for the federal government or for defense contracts. And on top of that, loyalty was a moving target. These lists would grow arbitrarily. A lot of times the accusations were really just gossip. But even if a worker refuted an accusation, it stayed in their file afterwards. We're going to see specifically a lot of New Dealers and people who were associated with the presumably liberal East Coast and its institutions be a lot of the targets. And so what we see coming out of this is that federal employees are going to work under this like cloud of fear that at any moment they could be accused and potentially fired. We're also going to see another big target of this is going to be homosexuals. Basically, they tried to identify homosexuals who they think were targets for blackmail by like foreign agents and everything. Overall, though, with this executive order, this is going to result in about 1,210 firings as well as 6,000 resignations under Truman alone. And then when you get Dwight Eisenhower, the next president, he's going to have comparable numbers during his first term from 1953 through 1956. The thing is, that was just the executive branch. What about Congress? So Congress is going to be even busier than the executive branch. They are going to set up the House Committee on Un-American Activities, or HUAC. The House Un-American Activities Committee. Basically, they're going to investigate any un-American propaganda. This starts in about 1945, and their big juicy target was Hollywood. We're going to see hearings in October of 1947. Many individuals are going to assure HUAC of their anti-communist sentiment, but we see others who worked for Hollywood would refuse to discuss their past political associations, citing freedom of speech, which is protected by the First Amendment. Technically speaking, you have the right to be a communist or to believe those things, especially as that is a political institution. The thing is, this defense failed in the Supreme Court, and we see 10 different individuals basically going to jail. This movement against Hollywood is going to really push them away from left-leaning politics. We see other individuals in Hollywood be blacklisted in fear that they might put like propaganda that was communist propaganda into their movies. The thing is, a lot of this, we see officials badger those who they're questioning, not into necessarily confessions, but into making them identify friends or family members or associates who they might suspect as being involved in some sort of communist activity or just suspect activity at all. We're also going to see issues with the Fifth Amendment. So the Fifth Amendment protects Americans from testifying against yourself. This is when people say, I plead the Fifth, and the idea is that I don't want to basically find myself guilty by admitting something. The thing is, if an individual used this as a defense during the Second Red Scare, basically people automatically assumed that, oh, then you must be a Fifth Amendment communist. That the only reason you're not talking about it is because you clearly are a communist, even though it might have been, I don't want my words to be used against me and such. And so we're actually going to see a lot of people fired for using the Fifth Amendment. We see a lot of people across the nation, their names are dragged through the mud, and it becomes even harder for them to find another job now that they have this stain on their record, basically. We're also going to have some subversion trials. I don't go into detail here about it, but I wanted to mention it because it's a great section that I would recommend you definitely read in your book. However, the most well-known participant in the Second Red Scare really was Senator Joseph McCarthy of Wisconsin. He was crude, he was sly, he was ambitious, and he latches on to this issue of communist subversion. Supposedly, at one point, he said something along the lines of, I have here in my hand a list of 205 who were known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party and who nevertheless are still working and shaping the policy of the State Department. The reason I say he said something along these lines is because he said something along these lines multiple times. And that number of 205 changed to 57 at one point, then to 81, then to 10, then to 116. So you can see some problems with this. His rise to fame really climaxes with this incoherent 6-hour speech to the Senate. The next few years, his speeches were being aimed at moving targets, and they were full of multiple untruths. Basically, he threw out so many accusations, true and false, that the facts just never could catch up. So the thing is, the Senate basically disregarded McCarthy at first. But what the public sees is that they hear all these accusations, but they don't necessarily see the lack of evidence. Even at one point, Senator Joseph McCarthy said George Marshall, then the Secretary of Defense, was an agent of communism, and this is ridiculous. Joseph Marshall, had been an architect in victory in World War II, and then he had been a huge contributor to the stabilization of Europe. I mean, it's the Marshall Plan. But McCarthy is still extremely popular, so much so that the Republicans would actually feature him in 1952 in their convention. And in fact, their presidential candidate, Dwight Eisenhower, failed to defend Marshall during this time period. Still, McCarthy's personal crudeness, while on one hand this makes him this like media star, it eventually basically undermined him. All of these confrontations he had led to more and more televised hearings, and basically cameras are taping him, and this is bringing political debates into the living room of people's homes. And there, people judged McCarthy's bullying style from the comfort of their home and were not appreciative of it. The end comes pretty quickly for McCarthy. You get things like a comic strip that was clearly trying to make fun of him. And then we get the United States Senate would vote 67 to 22 in December of 1954 to condemn McCarthy of conduct unbefitting a member of the Senate. They basically censure him, which is a formal group condemnation of an individual. And basically that is going to ruin any individual's career at that point. However, as much as the end of McCarthy came pretty quickly, the whole anti-subversive campaign that is generally known as McCarthyism, it's going to last longer. Basically, the fear of communist subversion really reached deep in American society. We're going to see cities and states require oaths from recipients of like unemployment compensation during this time period, and all of this comes down to McCarthyism. There are 4 driving factors of McCarthyism. The first one was a legitimate concern about atomic spies, a legitimate concern about, Russian, Soviet Union spies. The second was there is an undercurrent of anti-Semitism and nativism in America. And this is a trend that we've been seeing in this class, and it's continued on. The third was specifically you see in like the South and the West, a resentment towards the nation's Ivy League elite. And then you have the fourth. The fourth really came down to this fear that the world was spinning out of control. And basically people are going to try to seek out easy explanations for all of the global tensions going on. So for instance, looking at like China when it was lost to the communists, it's better in the eyes of many Americans for China to have fallen to the communists because of American traders than because the actual strength behind the ideology of communism. So what we're really seeing here is a lot of partisan politics means that Republicans are going to use the Red Scare to attack like New Dealers and liberal Democrats. And we saw even with McCarthy himself, they used McCarthy and then they abandoned him. So how can you compare the Red Scare to today?